Today we had a very interesting masterclass for journalists who write stories on trade, on business and economics in Africa. And part of the reason why this was important is that we don't get diversity of stories from business journalists. It's not often that journalists write stories about land and trade. And so we wanted to be able to build their capacity to understand why it's vital for them to write stories on how, if we accelerate trade in Africa, we can transform land on the continent. And if we also do good policies or develop good policies, we can also accelerate trade on the continent. So we are building capacity. We had very good ideas about land governance and the stories that journalists could write about. For example, stories about large-scale land-based investments, stories about our resources, stories about women's land rights, stories about agriculture, and so on. And as well as industrial development. So they got quite a bit of sources of information. They also got information on how to get data and statistics from different websites. So we shared the websites with them. We shared information on CFTA and the opportunity that CFTA provides to the continent of Africa and what journalists can do to cover CFTA in a better way. So we gave them a lot of information about CFTA and the potential for it to transform Africa. We also shared information on women's land rights, and especially how women participate in cross-border trade. Women in the informal trade, whether it's clothing, whether it is food products, and so on. So they got quite a bit of that information. We were also able to support them to understand the role of data in journalism, how they process data, how they extract it and make stories more interesting. And finally, we also built their capacity on rule of law indicators. For example, open governance, the fact that our governments should provide data to media and to the general public. So open governance, the absence of corruption, the limits of government, what governments can do and what governments cannot do, the role of judiciary, issues of fundamental rights of public and so on, and the ways in which when they do their coverage of land and trade issues, they should be able to dig deeper to understand what's going on in the ground and increased accountability and transparency. We think that the journalists really also wanted to understand how they can be supported by CFTA and how they can be supported by different institutions. And we basically told them, look, these institutions can be sources of information. They can be sources of data for them, but that we would expect that they diversify, their stories. And they also give us, positive stories about Africa, not just negative stories about the continent, because there are things that the continent is doing that is good and is right, and actually they need to carry those positive stories from the continent. And I think that they are looking forward to covering the conference because we challenge them to cover the conference in its diversity. And I think that we will end up with a better reportage of the conference and better reportage of land and trade in Africa.